Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Greg Lidker-Morris and I'm the Policy Manager here at Abatable, a carbon procurement and intelligence service. I'll be moderating today's session, which is in collaboration with Gold Standard, a leading standards and verification body in the carbon market. Now, today's webinar is focused on the intertwined risk we see with the CORSIA market as it enters phase one, the ongoing development of Article 6 mechanisms, and the risk of revocation of correspondingly adjusted credits. This is providing a challenging landscape to investors, buyers, and developers in the market. And fortunately, I'm joined by a fantastic panel today to discuss these issues. We have Lisa DeMarco, CEO and Senior Partner at Resilient, Molly Peters-Stanley, the Lead for International Markets at the US Department of State, Hugh Salway, Senior Director of Market Development and Partnerships at Gold Standard, and Rob Stevens, Director of Product Development at Climate Impact Partners. Thanks all for joining me today. Now, I'm sure many of you in the audience will have questions you'd like to pose to our panel today. And so you are able to join in and pose those questions by scanning the QR code on your screen now, or going to slido.com and entering the code in front of you. You can then pose your questions in there, and you'll also be able to vote on questions that other audience members post, and we'll get to those in the second half of the webinar and focus on the most popular ones, but we'll try and get through as many as we can. And we'd like to begin the webinar by just getting to know a bit the audience we have with us. So again, if you haven't already, please scan the QR code. And if you'd let us know where you're joining us from today. So it looks like a fair number of people from Europe and Asia, but quite a wide variety of regions, which makes sense given the global nature of the challenges that we're going to be discussing today. Perfect, thank you. And our second poll before we get into this is, how do you and your organization interact with CORSIA and or Article 6 credits? Okay, so again, quite a mixed range of interactions with these mechanisms. So I think it probably shows how there is some real need for further information across the market at the moment and how engaged the whole market is with these challenges. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that. As mentioned, please do continue to pose your questions as the webinar continues. And if you spot one you like, do make sure you vote for that to move forward. Now, before we move to our panel discussion, I'll provide a brief overview of Article 6 and CORSIA. So, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement acknowledges countries can use voluntary cooperation in the implementation of their nationally determined contributions, allowing for higher mitigation ambition. In doing so, a host country of a carbon project producing mitigation outcomes can agree to transfer some or all of these units to another country. And in the event of this happening, the host country must remove the mitigation outcome from their national account and not count this towards their own NDC, and rather this is transferred to the buyer who may use it towards their own NDC. Now, in order to ensure against double counting in both national registries, an accounting mechanism known as corresponding adjustments will be applied. And for units to receive corresponding adjustments, they will first require a letter of authorization from host countries. Beyond NDCs, these corresponding adjusted credits can be used for other purposes, and this includes CORSIA Phase 1, where international airlines from participating states must procure credits with CORSIA with corresponding adjusted credits to meet obligations. However, So far, very few states currently have the regulation, the governance, and the infrastructure in place to manage the authorization process, and this is severely restricting supply. And moreover, at recent COPs, we've seen negotiations lead towards discussions around how host countries may revoke the transfer of credits with corresponding adjustments even after trades have taken place, which poses a serious risk to operators in Article 6 and CORSIA markets as business is done. Turning to CORSIA then, this is the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. This governs international aviation emissions outside of nationally determined contributions and was developed by the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, which you may hear referred to throughout this webinar. Now, it's an incremental scheme which moves from voluntary to mandatory for international airlines of ICAO states to offset their emissions against 2019 baselines. The pilot phase was a voluntary phase where reporting was completed from the beginning of 2021 to the end of 2023. And for airlines in participating states, they now have until the end of January 2025 to retire eligible units. Phase 1, which is also voluntary, but we'll see 126 states participating, began at the beginning of January 2024 this year, and reporting runs until the end of 2026. And phase 2, which begins in 2027, will then become mandatory for all ICAO states' international airlines. Demand modeling, as you can see on the left, has suggested that phase 1 could see anything between 64 to 164 million credits demanded, while phase 2 demand models 1 to 2 billion credits. However, to date, phase 1 only has 2 standards in the market as eligible for for credits. That's the American Carbon Registry and the Architecture for RED Plus Transactions, or ARC-TREES. However, notably, we do have several other standards conditionally approved. Phase 1 credits must also be vintage 2021 or newer, and crucially for today's discussion, require corresponding adjustments. So, with this in mind, I'll turn to our panel. Molly, perhaps I can start with you. COP didn't deliver the outcomes many in the market were hoping for around Article 6. Can you perhaps shed some light on what happened during the negotiations and what impact these might have on CORSIA?
Certainly. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'll start with COP28, which from a procedural standpoint was challenging to follow, even if you were in Dubai. Parties had worked throughout 2023 on a substantial list of work program items that came out of Egypt COP27. And some of these seemed aimed at sort of reinforcing or clarifying decisions that were taken at COP27. Others seemed to conflict with and potentially renegotiate items that had been decided at COP26 or in COP27, or even in some instances in Paris. And so that was extremely challenging for parties, simply because there was so much negotiating history that informed the decisions that had been taken to date, combined with a sort of new cast of characters in the negotiating room, some of whom had been there for all of the decisions and the work that preceded them, and others who were new to this space. And I think the amount of time required to bring parties onto the same page and to sort of have a level playing field in terms of the understanding of what came before and even what was in the COP27 decision on Article 6.2 in particular, which was pretty expansive. 1 year did not allow for that. And certainly not the time that we had at COP28. Examples of negotiations items that seemed like they would supersede COP26 or COP27 outcomes, and that are particularly relevant for CORSIA included proposals for defining cooperative approaches and in ways that would have required that there's a party on both sides of a transfer when it comes to Article 6.2 reporting and accounting. That would have required a party that administers an airline in its state to report on the credits that its airlines use toward CORSIA, even if these are not counted toward the country's NDC, and even if the airline and the state have already implemented very similar but even more detailed reporting requirements under the CORSIA's standards. At COP26 and in that decision, parties were very clear that credits that are used in CORSIA must be authorized by the host party under Article 6.2, such that corresponding adjustments are applied and double counting is avoided. But we didn't require that all parties report on what's used in CORSIA because there's not necessarily a double counting risk that would require the party that hosts the airline to also report on those transfers. But because CORSIA is mandatory for a broad majority of states from 2027 onward, that would have meant that for all of those states, Article 6.2 effectively becomes mandatory and involuntary, which contradicts paragraph 6.1 and 6.3 of Article 6, and would have required us to expand on what was agreed in Glasgow. That's just one example. A number of proposals would have, I think, delivered an earlier stage review of the standards or the regulations that underpin a cooperative approach. In some cases, that was related back to another proposal for the Article 6.2 International Registry to not only function as a tracking system for parties to submit their information on ITMOs, to potentially transfer that information or data to another party, but to also build that registry to issue carbon credits, tradable carbon credits with or without authorization or a direct relationship to Article 6.2. And to provide for market access to those credits for parties that have credited cooperative approaches and want to enable tradable units. So it would be something similar to some of the independent registry providers that already operate in this marketplace. Those were big proposals with significant implications, and parties weren't, some parties weren't ready to adopt those, and felt that they required more discussion. So that said, one thing that was incomplete as of COP28 remains the agreed electronic format. So the tables that parties would use to report annual information on ITMOs. Those tables are actually fairly similar to and aligned with the tables that states use to report on credits that are used by their airlines in CORSIA. And those tables would have been invaluable to have in a fully finalized form for states that are going to authorize credits for use in CORSIA. However, the tables that were, I guess, in a way provisionally adopted for further testing at COP27 didn't undergo significant revision throughout last year. And so the tables that were considered at COP28 were fairly in line with what was discussed at COP27. Those tables are available and for parties that want to authorize credits for CORSIA, it seems likely that that previous version from COP27 that was attached to that decision would be the table that they would utilize. Beyond that, most of the decisions that were under consideration at COP28 would have clarified or provided additional detail in existing guidance. But it's important to recognize that the guidance that was adopted at COP26 was the guidance that was called for in Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. And if you look at the way that the agenda items under this negotiation are structured, they reflect that now. And it's important to recognize that, because it's helpful for parties and market participants to understand that that's guidance that can be applied and can be applied now. And so from that perspective, COP28 could have provided some valuable clarifications, but it isn't the fact that parties didn't reach agreement there on additional guidance on 6.2. It doesn't prevent parties from being able to authorize and enable eligibility of credits for CORSIA now. On the CORSIA side, there is still work underway in a number of certification standards to internalize those decisions that were taken at COP26 and 27 and integrate procedures into their standards that point back to those requirements on the UNFCCC side under the Paris Agreement, where they need to in order to give, I think, ICAO clarity, but also market participants clarity as to how the standards bodies themselves are going to interact with country reports, with national authorizations as these things start to come through. And so that is really a focus for the US and its capacity building programs this year, and other countries as well. But also on the ICAO side, to encourage countries to start thinking through what those processes look like to finalize their national arrangements for participating in Article 6, but also for standards bodies to wrap up the work on those additional procedures, so that the number and types of activities that are eligible to generate CORSIA eligible credits for this current compliance phase can expand, including into new geographies.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you. And Lita, perhaps if I turn to you now, could you sort of unpack a little further how the current state of play with Article 6 and CORSIA impacts sort of market participants, the corporate buyers, investors, and developers in the market?
I'd be happy to. Unfortunately, we do, as Molly said, and she's been very much a diplomat in how she's approached describing what happened at COP28. We're left with some uncertainties is the unfortunate outcome. And she is the winner of the award of the most patient negotiator of the year after going through that. In particular, she spoke of the agreed electronic format. And this is the one thing that would be really nice to have for an additional piece of certainty for all participants in CORSIA and related Article 6 transactions. And it's really that very simple form that says, here's the information you need to submit, and to know that you've submitted to ensure you've done everything you need to do to avoid liability under CORSIA effectively, and to know that you've complied with all the requirements, and going forward into the program, you'll be able to use those units without concern. And so we have a draft form that was provided, and shameless plug for the Canadian negotiators, was pushed by the Canadian negotiators this year to be used as the form going forward. And that was done at Sharm el-Sheikh in COP27. And unfortunately, we had no agreement on there. And there appeared to be concerted effort by two disparate parties to really renegotiate some of those agreed requirements and decisions, not just going back to Sharm, but also going back to Glasgow, and in certain instances, the detailed elements of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So in terms of what does this mean for the market, I think there's a little bit of business as usual prior to the COP approach, with the knowledge and understanding that both CORSIA and the eligibility use criteria and the standards and reporting procedures, the SARPs under CORSIA, require a couple of elements to be undertaken, including corresponding adjustments for units submitted in this phase. And so given the fact that we don't have many programs and many countries in the position to issue or provide for some assurance of corresponding adjustments, I think we have two countries at this point, with one in play and announced. We've got some work to do over the next 2-year compliance period. And we've got to provide some certainty to the marketplace. This is how we're proceeding in the void created by the outcome of this negotiation. But we are proceeding. And we are proceeding because the atmosphere is not waiting for us to get these details right. So looking at that, I think there are a number of provisions ongoing within the standards providers. And I look to Gold Standard and the American Carbon Registry and others to help facilitate some of the procedural certainty around this is what we've got available on corresponding adjustments, and this is a line of communication for countries to help with the associated submissions, but being very clear that the airlines themselves and the entities actually undertaking the purchase and sale of the correspondingly adjusted units are not liable for the country's compliance status. And that really comes from the heart of going all the way back to Section 7 of CORSIA and the related SARPs and eligibility criteria. So we're not going to redo that in the negotiations. And I think there would be a bright white line from a number of countries really implementing that associated requirement and that path forward. So that's kind of a little bit of flavor. I will say I found some of the negotiations to be quite unprincipled, and in particular, the alliance between the EU and the Coalition of Rainforest Nations to actively negate any consensus building appeared to be a perfection is the enemy of the good approach on the one side, and an approach to try and upend all Article 6 related transactions on the other hand. So that's not where we need to go right now. We are 5.5 years away from 2030, and we need to have material progress in this sector, and to do so in a way that is good, maybe not perfect, but really good, and has been subject to very thorough and detailed negotiations of ICAO through the TAB, and resulting in the ICAO CORSIA program is really where we need to go and implement quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think perhaps as you touched on the back of that, Rob, I wanted to turn to you and ask a little about the supply in the market. So given the very limited number of credits authorized for corresponding adjustments and the small number of countries with the infrastructure and the governance to authorize credits, where is the supply of CORSIA Phase 1 eligible credits going to come from, and when do you expect that to start to come to market?
Well, firstly, thanks for the simple question, Greg. I'll do my best to give our view. and yeah, I think Lisa and Molly have demonstrated that there's still a lot of complexity and a lot of thinking going on with the kind of policy infrastructure. Before I attempt to answer, or at least give some options of where I think the supply might come from, I just want to reiterate what the size of the challenge is. It's almost exactly 4 years until airlines have to submit their CORSIA eligible credits at the end of phase 1. And as you saw from your graph, it could be up to 165 million tons of CORSIA eligible credits required. As of today, I think this is still true. There aren't any. There are 0. So even if, speaking from a project developer's point of view, if we start today, getting up to volume is going to be a challenge. In terms of where CORSIA eligible credits might come from, I mean, the first place to start, obviously, is with the 2 eligible standards at the moment, ARTREES and ACR. ARTREES has started to issue some fairly large volumes over the last year and a half or so. And if any participating nations, but they're usually national programs, agree to correspondingly adjust those volumes, then that could be, they may be the first CORSIA eligible credits to market. I don't have a view or understanding of how likely that is. Maybe there are others on the panel that we can speak about that in a moment. But I'm assuming that the conditional standards will become eligible at some point. In which case that opens up other project opportunities. I think one of the challenges at the moment is all Article 6 or nearly all Article 6 activity, project development activity to date has been within the context of bilateral agreements with host governments, with buyer governments as the buying country. So we've set up a competition for CORSIA eligible credits with other buyers. I think the biggest challenge is at the moment, firstly, the lack of readiness, if you like, of host countries to provide CAs, and secondly, this issue of liability as a project developer or as a credit owner, of selling, for example, to end buyer airlines, and whether at some point along that chain a revocation of a promise of a corresponding adjustment happens, and as a project developer or a seller of those credits, that potential liability is very difficult, I think, to manage from a risk point of view at the moment. So just to kind of finish off, it's really difficult to see. It's, however this works out, it's going to be a challenge to get that many credits issued and ready to be surrendered in 4 years. One other thing that would be useful, I think, and we've seen this so far, is an increase in engagement from the aviation sector would also help, I think, the market to overcome some of these challenges. I think at the moment, from my experience with the aviation sector at the minute, they're still in education phase, actually, and see it as still something to that maybe they don't have to engage with at this point. They can wait for a little bit longer, but I think I would urge the aviation sector to start engaging more deeply and to help push through some of these challenges and to facilitate a quicker production of credits.
Well, very well answered for a difficult question, Rob. So good job.
Thank you.
Hugh, I'll turn to you now, and perhaps we can keep it brief as we've got loads of questions coming in from the audience that I want to get to as well. But I know Gold Standard has recently begun to tag Article 6 eligible credits on your registry. What do you see as the role for independent standards in CORSIA and Article 6 markets, and what requirements do projects have to meet to be listed as eligible for these on the gold standard?
Great, thank you. So you're right. So gold standard labeled the first credits in our registry as having an Article 6 authorization last autumn, so in autumn 2023. So we have 2 programs of activities which have now received a letter of authorization and have been labeled as such in our registry. We've had those requirements in place for over a year before that point. And I think that's important to say because partly reflecting on some of the conversation we've had so far, there's a lot of stuff which needs to come together for supply of eligible CORSIA units and Article 6 units in the market. One part is standards like us having the ability to manage Article 6 authorizations. But the most important part is governments having in place the frameworks to give those authorizations, to manage them well, and the willingness to do so as well. And so I guess I'm saying that because gold standard is not fully approved for phase 1 yet. We are conditionally approved, but us getting full approval, if that does come, doesn't automatically mean there is a significant supply of credits for CORSIA phase 1, which comes through. That needs a lot of things to come into play. It needs governments introducing the frameworks for Article 6. As Rob was saying, it needs, I think, that clear activity from the aviation sector as well to go into agreements and to start to kind of make clear that demand early on for those credits for phase 1. I think this is a different phase to the phase which we've just gone through, the pilot phase, which had zero demand or very close to zero demand, I think, had a lot of supply. We're entering into a really different phase now. It is more complicated with Article 6 authorizations, and it needs to be managed differently by airlines who are looking to comply. How we manage this in gold standard, it's really how Molly was describing this earlier, the role of a crediting program. We make sure in our crediting program that any credits that we label as Article 6 authorized are compliant with the requirements which governments face under Article 6. So when we look at letters of authorization, we're looking to make sure that it has all of the different elements that a government needs to provide. We understand when they're going to apply a corresponding adjustment. We understand that they provided an explicit authorization. They agree to apply that corresponding adjustment at the appropriate time. We check that they do apply that corresponding adjustment later on. We check that they are submitting a report to show that they meet the participation requirements. But ours is really making sure that there is Article 6 compliance of the credits in our registry. And again, another thing which is important to say, I think, is we're moving into, and we've said this has been said a lot, but we're moving into a different phase for the carbon market where we don't have voluntary and compliance. For gold standard going forward, we really see ourselves as one standard issuing one version of a quality carbon credit, which is then differentiated for use depending on whether it has an Article 6 authorization and what that is authorized for. So there's not a different quality of credit under Article 6 versus not under Article 6. There is quality credits which are either eligible for use in Article 6 or not eligible. And that's important when thinking about the supply of credits and how this looks in the future. But I'll stop there.
Perfect, thank you. Molly, perhaps just quickly before we go to the audience questions, because I think this question might cover a few of some of the questions coming up from the audience. Focusing a little on revocations that's been mentioned, I wonder what instances might we see revocation of credits happen, and what are the major hurdles that need to be overcome for consensus on this issue at the next COP?
Thanks. I'd say here again that like many of the other issues at COP28, reaching consensus on this issue is really going to require further discussion and an understanding of the experience that other carbon marketplaces have had with what amounts to these sorts of liability issues and how they've managed those. The notion of revocation of an authorization is a sensitive one for parties that want to ensure that Article 6.2 reporting and accounting requirements and their tracking systems avoid double counting and that any changes to authorizations that would scale back those authorizations are accurately reflected throughout party systems in the Article 6.2 reporting and accounting context. But it's important to recognize here too that parties at COP26 recognized that changes to authorizations happen when they require parties to report on any changes to authorizations and information about authorizations in their regular information that goes in their BTRs. It's also helpful to understand that not all changes would narrow an authorization scope. More often, these are likely to expand the scope of an authorization. But where a change would narrow or fully revoke or withdraw, whatever word you want to use, the scope of an authorization, there's understandable concern about the uncertainties that this would create in the marketplace. That's why some parties supported proposals for clarifying that where Article 6.2 guidance refers to providing information on authorizations, that information should include any conditions or terms pertaining to changes, particularly those that would narrow or withdraw an authorization. But again, these may be positive additive conditions. They may also include conditions related to substantive expectations for an authorized standards body or activities to continually adhere to domestic legal requirements or environmental or social safeguards. Or you could foresee these relating to the status of diplomatic or commercial trade relations between the host party and an authorized party. There are actually any number of reasons why revocations could occur, and not all of these are nefarious. Most of them are not, if any of them. I think we always think about the sort of worst case scenarios here, but there are practical reasons why this would be enabled. In the context of export authorizations in other markets, even though we wouldn't consider 6.2 transfers to be truly equivalent to other export types, you'll see a number of higher level considerations such as these being reflected in either the overarching agreements that govern those exports or in the authorizations themselves. But that doesn't mean that the market will or should be left hanging. And here there's actually some, I think, positive experience already in CORSIA due to its guidelines for criteria interpretation that include requirements for eligible standards bodies to have procedures in place for replacing credits that were covered by a country's authorization, but where the adjustments are not ultimately applied. That could be due to accounting irregularities. It could be due to the narrowing of the scope of the authorization. In any case, this is a very important provision from a CORSIA perspective because it ensures that there are upfront provisions in place that will be implemented or triggered if there is a change to an authorization. So there's a sort of related requirement that standards bodies have provisions in place to actually monitor the appropriate country reports as they're provided to the UNFCCC. But all of that ensures that airlines are not left holding the bag because there was an aim to avoid buyer liability in those discussions when the criteria, the guidelines were being written. And this was the clearest way that could be ensured on the ICAO side. We don't have significant concerns about how this can be addressed in the reporting systems within the Paris context. Anyone who follows inventory guidance and the types of changes that are made to inventory figures in detailed tables or where these are rolled up into national inventory emissions totals. These change over time as methodological guidance changes. And parties have proven themselves able to make and explain and reflect those changes. And we would expect the same here.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks very much. I think we'll move to some audience questions. We've got loads of interaction so far. So the top question is, when will Gold Standard and Vera get full approval? I assume that's referring to CORSIA phase 1. I believe there's expected to be more information on the conditionally approved standards by the end of March this year. But Hugh, maybe I'll just hand over to you if you have any more information on that at all.
So I don't. I mean, Gold Standard obviously hopes that we are made fully approved when there's next a decision on this for phase 1. The steps that we've taken to make sure that we're compliant, or to try to make sure we're compliant with the CORSIA rules, but this is a decision which is out of our hands. So I'm afraid, at least from me, no news at this point. I mean, just kind of quickly going on the back of the point which Molly was making about revocation earlier. As a standard, this was the most difficult thing to try to introduce into requirements, how to manage cases of revocation or non-application of corresponding adjustments. And there are really no kind of perfect options for how to manage this, and it's really a choice. And I also think this is an area that will probably evolve over time as we understand what this looks like in practice, as Article 6 negotiations change as well. And there's a really important point about trying to manage the risk of buyer liability. Project developers also don't want to take on that liability. They don't want to be developing a project and then suddenly find themselves faced with reconciliation of units. And so how to manage this is really difficult, especially if we're talking about cases of unilateral authorization where there isn't an umbrella between two governments that may be able to resolve any issues. So this is the most difficult issue to manage. It doesn't mean it's not resolvable. I think it also shouldn't be sort of read as a case that every second unit will be subject to a revocation. I think we will find this being rare if it comes through. Governments will face real reputational blowback if there are revocations which aren't really justified and based in something which kind of has standing. But it's the most difficult thing for a standard setter to try to translate through to our requirements.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. We have several other questions. So it feels like airlines aren't engaging too much with CORSIA yet. Why do you think that is another one of our most liked questions. Lisa, perhaps I can come to you first on this one.
Yeah, it's basically an allocation of risk question. And at this point, the airlines are a little concerned with the uncertainties and the potential of risk in and around the issues that we've been speaking about, specifically in and around buyer liability, revocations. And I want to separate out in that revocation discussion two things. First, revocation of the units, and then secondly, revocation of the authorization for the entities involved in creating the units. And I think one is much easier to manage than the other. And looking forward at where we're at to mitigate those risks, a lot of the negotiations historically at Sharm el-Sheikh and hopefully going forward are in and around retrospective and retroactive revocation of units versus prospective actions. And I think that clarification will go a long way to know that once something has been authorized, once someone has been authorized, what's been created by the entity, that project, under an authorized fashion is good, unless and until an authorization has been revoked or amended in a way that negatively impacts the quantities. So I expect to see that come forward in the negotiations. And we've seen this in the CDM, right? You don't want to reach back into historically authorized and issued certified emission reductions and adjust quantities that have already been created. You want to change methodologies and issues going forward. And in that way, you mitigate some, not all, but some of the risks. So I think the airlines themselves are trying to, in a context where they're a little bit under attack, right? We have several lawsuits that have been issued against them in and around greenwashing and consumer protection. They're very reluctant to take steps that would materially increase their risk. Once we have a bit more clarity and more supply and more certainty from the countries themselves, I think we'll have more airlines engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rob, I wonder if you wanted to comment on this as well from your perspective as with the...
Yeah. I think there are a few reasons that we've experienced as to why airlines are not yet fully engaging in this. I mean, firstly, in many cases, they have much more material issues around fuel procurement, for example, which is by far their biggest outlay. I think there's still a perception, many, that it's still a long way off. And also, it's not usual for airlines within their normal business model to be going too far upstream in their usual sort of business activities. You know, they and what we're asking them to do at the moment is to start thinking about early investment in projects or offtake agreements in projects. That's the point we're at the moment, and that's not what they're used to doing. That they don't they don't go upstream past fuel production or aircraft production, for example. So it doesn't fit into their normal business model. And then, Lisa, I think you made a good point there. There's still a conflation between voluntary action and this as a compliance obligation. I think that there is a general sensitivity amongst aviation partners that we have around voluntary action and what's happened with the Delta case, for example, and not separating these two issues essentially, and just going through the process of educating them. This is a compliance issue that they have is interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's a good point that it's sort of new ground for airlines. Just looking at a few other questions. So, Molly, perhaps I'll put this one to you. Why should countries worry about NDCs at all when there are zero penalties, whereas CORSIA has hard target deadlines and penalties to come? And perhaps I'll ask everyone to try and keep their answers 1 minute now so that we can try and get as many in before the end of the session as well.
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think it's the question about penalties and host parties. I mean, the Paris Agreement is a bottom-up framework, and so there are not financial penalties, I guess, fees, fines, if a party misses its target or fails to do something that it said it would do voluntarily. At the same time, I think that I wouldn't underestimate the effectiveness of peer pressure amongst parties and the facilitative process itself. Over time, I think in the beginning, no one really knew what to expect when it came to, the language in the Paris Agreement about increasing the ambition of NDCs over time. And we have seen that that's been extremely effective, not because of what was said on paper, but because of the ways that parties have supported, encouraged, and sort of reinforced those actions directly, diplomatically, and in the Paris Agreement and other forums as well. So I don't really know how to relate that back to airlines, but hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it certainly does. Hugh, perhaps I can direct this one towards you. We've had a question about the ICVCM, which has said they will fast track CORSIA eligible methodologies for CCP labels. And the question is, how do you see the interaction between these independent governing bodies and Article 6?
Yeah, so I think what ICVCM has done is they have said that they will take CORSIA as the basis when reviewing crediting programs. So when reviewing eligibility of gold standard for the ICVCM, CORSIA is the basis, and we've met CORSIA requirements for the pilot phase, and then there are additional elements which ICVCM has added on. So this isn't, I believe, so much looking at methodologies, but more looking at the level of the crediting program. And from our perspective, that's good for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it kind of points to the fact there is a consistent understanding between CORSIA, ICVCM at a base level of what quality looks like. But it also just simply streamlines the process for standard setters, which I'm sure everyone here cares about. We don't need to fill in multiple different forms the whole time, which is slightly different. So there's an efficiency to what they've done there as well.
Great, and perhaps just time for one more before we close up today. So Lisa, maybe I'll direct this one to you. Somebody's asked, will phase 1 of CORSIA provide any specific guidance or requirements to steer airline operators towards CDR?
Yeah, CORSIA has guidelines already on CORSIA eligible fuels. And so that associated diversity of sustainable aviation fuel and CORSIA eligible fuels, which have an associated carbon intensity that's about 10% lower than global average. So I think it's 89.1 is the number, is complex. And we do see that being a very active approach to compliance for airlines right now. The publicly announced large deal between Airbus and Oxy 1.5 to purchase carbon dioxide removals. And there are a series of subsequent airlines that have been very active in the CDR purchase and SAF purchase front. So certainly CDRs are an interesting early compliance route that are seen to be not as fraught with the associated uncertainties, but we still have a related authorization if they take place in a jurisdiction outside of where the airline is located. So slightly less uncertainty, maybe not completely certain.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay, we are unfortunately coming up on time. I was going to give you each 30 seconds more to end the webinar, but I think I'm going to have to slash that down to 15 seconds at this point. So I wondered if I could just get one last word from each of you on the piece of advice you would have for participants in the market, considering their strategy towards correspondingly adjusted credits this year. Rob, maybe I'll come to you first on this one.
I was really hoping you wouldn't say my name first then. I really think it's around understanding host country policy frameworks and willingness and ability to engage.
Perfect. Thank you. And Lisa, perhaps to you next.
I'm going to amplify Rob's comments with the statement that all politics is local. So to the extent that you can come up with a very certain and well-documented regime with a country, particularly a G77 country, I think it will be very difficult for the rules to somehow usurp that well-documented sovereign entities agreement.
Yeah, well said. And Hugh, perhaps to you, your one piece of advice.
Yeah, I think mine is very similar to Rob. So if you're an airline or someone supporting them, understand the difference between this phase we're going into now and the pilot phase and the interaction with Article 6. And for that reason, start planning now for 2027.
Perfect. And then Molly, you can have the final word on this one.
Okay. would echo everything that was just said. You know, the time is now, and parties have what they need. But they certainly need support. And focusing on helping countries get over whatever hurdles they've identified to providing authorizations. You know, we encourage the market to support that. You know, and I say that looking ahead to Article 6 to review. The review of the guidance kicks off in 2028. We need to have something to review and some actual, you know, learned experience and practical lessons to inform that. And that means that we can't wait for the perfect guidance. We won't even know what that is if we don't try what we have now. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your insights today. They've been really interesting to listen to. And thank you again to everyone who's attended this webinar and posted their questions. And I do hope everyone has found it really useful. We'll be hosting further webinars in collaboration with Gold Standard in the coming months. So do keep an eye out for that. And in the meantime, thanks again, everyone, for joining this webinar. And wherever you are, do enjoy the rest of your day.